My name is Detective Mike Harrison, and I've been with the Washington State Police for 15 years. I've seen drug busts gone wrong, domestic violence calls that'll haunt you forever, and crime scenes that would make a grown man cry. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what I encountered in the Olympic National Forest on October 15, 2023. This is my story, and I'm telling it because the public deserves to know what's really out there in those woods. What I saw that night wasn't a bear, wasn't a man in a costume, and it sure as hell wasn't my imagination. I've been a skeptic my whole life, the kind of cop who deals in facts and evidence, not fairy tales and campfire stories. But sometimes the evidence points to something you never thought possible. I grew up in Seattle, the son of a Boeing engineer and a high school teacher. My childhood was filled with science museums, nature documentaries, and camping trips too. Mount Rainier, my father taught me to question everything, to look for logical explanations, to trust in what could be measured and proven. When I joined the police force at 22, fresh out of the criminal justice program at the University of Washington, I brought that same analytical mindset to law enforcement. I'd seen enough human behavior to know that people lie, they exaggerate, they see what they want to see. I'd taken statements from witnesses who swore they saw things that security cameras proved never happened. I'd investigated reports of supernatural activity that always turned out to have perfectly rational explanations. So when I tell you that what I encountered in those woods defied everything I thought I knew about the world, understand that this admission comes from someone who has spent his entire adult life debunking the impossible. The call came in around 11:30 p.m. on a Tuesday night. I was finishing up paperwork on a routine traffic stop when dispatch crackled through my radio with a report of strange sounds and possible poaching activity near the Oho River Trail. The caller was a park ranger named Sarah Chen, someone I'd worked with before on various incidents. Sarah wasn't the type to call in false alarms or get spooked easily. She'd been patrolling the area when she heard what she described as inhuman screaming coming from deep in the forest. At first I figured it was probably just elk, or maybe someone's idea of a prank. The Olympic Peninsula gets its fair share of urban explorers and thrill seekers, especially around Halloween season. But Sarah insisted this was different. She said, the sounds were unlike anything she'd heard in her 12 years as a ranger. The screams were too deep, too powerful to be human, but too structured and intentional to be any known animal. Sarah Chen had been my go-to contact for incidents since I'd started working this district 5 years ago. She was a former Marine who'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan before coming home and deciding she wanted to spend her life protecting something beautiful instead of fighting in places that seemed determined to destroy themselves. She knew the Olympic National Forest better than anyone I'd ever met, could track a lost hiker through terrain that would challenge a bloodhound, and had an encyclopedic knowledge of every animal species in the region. If Sarah said she'd heard something unusual, it was worth investigating. If she said it was unlike anything she'd encountered in 12 years of ranger work, it was definitely worth investigating. I was about 40 minutes out from the trailhead when I got the call, finishing up paperwork on a routine traffic stop that had turned into a DUI arrest. My partner, Officer Janet Rodriguez, had called in sick that day with what she claimed was food poisoning, but what I suspected was actually a hangover from her sister's wedding the night before. Looking back, maybe that was for the best. What I experienced that night would have been hard enough to process on my own, let alone trying to convince someone else of what we'd witnessed together. Janet was a good cop, but she was also a by-the-book officer who had little patience for anything that couldn't be explained in standard police terminology. She would have insisted on calling for backup, following proper procedures, documenting everything according to department protocol, all of which would have scared away whatever we were about to encounter, and probably cost us the chance to make contact with something that science claimed didn't exist. The drive to the Olympic National Forest was eerily quiet. Usually, the radio chatter keeps you company on these late-night calls, but tonight the airwaves were dead. Even the usual background static seemed muted, like the whole world was holding its breath. I'd driven this route dozens of times before, responding to everything from lost hikers to illegal camping operations, but tonight felt different. The darkness seemed thicker, more oppressive. The headlights of my cruiser carved a narrow tunnel through the night. But beyond that cone of light, the world disappeared into an impenetrable black void that seemed to press in from all sides. The Olympic National Forest at night is a different beast entirely from its daytime counterpart. During the day, it's beautiful, almost magical, with those towering Douglas firs and the way the sunlight filters through the canopy in cathedral-like beams. The forest floor is carpeted with moss and ferns that seem to glow with their own inner light, and the sound of running water from dozens of streams and rivers creates a natural symphony that can calm even the most troubled mind. But at night, it becomes something else entirely, something ancient and primal that reminds you just how small and vulnerable you really are in the grand scheme of things, as I drove deeper into the forest. My headlights occasionally caught the reflection of eyes watching from the tree line, deer mostly, though I spotted what looked like a black bear about 2 miles from the ranger station. The bear was standing on its hind legs beside the road, and for a moment, in the distorted perspective created by my headlights and the darkness, it looked almost human. Almost, but not quite. There was something about the proportions that was wrong, something about the way it moved that didn't match any bear I'd ever seen. But when I slowed down to get a better look, it dropped to all fours and disappeared into the underbrush with the characteristic lumbering gait of a black bear. Just my imagination, I told myself. Just the darkness playing tricks on my eyes. I pulled into the ranger station parking lot around 12:15 a.m. Sarah's truck was there, along with another vehicle I didn't recognize, a beat-up Ford pickup with Oregon plates and enough camping gear. Strapped to the roof to outfit a small expedition, the license plate read HIKER1, and there were stickers from national parks all over the western United States covering the rear window. Whoever owned this truck was serious about outdoor recreation. The kind of person who probably spent more time in the wilderness than in civilization. Sarah met me at my cruiser before I'd even turned off the engine. Even in the dim light from the parking lot's single lamppost, I could see she was rattled. Sarah Chen is tough as nails. The kind of woman who can track a lost hiker for miles through rough terrain and still have energy to carry them out on her back if needed. I'd seen her face down angry bears, talk suicidal jumpers off cliff edges, and maintain her composure during search and rescue operations that would break most people. But tonight, her hands were shaking as she approached my car, and there was something in her eyes I'd never seen before. Fear? Yes, but also excitement. The kind of expression you might see on the face of an explorer who'd just discovered something that would change the world, if only they could convince anyone else to believe them. Mike. Thank God you're here, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It's gotten worse since I called it in. The sounds are coming from deeper in the forest now, maybe 2 miles up the Hoh River Trail, and there's something else. She paused, looking around nervously, as if she expected something to emerge from the tree line at any moment. There's a camper up there, guy named Tom Bradley from Portland. He called the ranger station about an hour ago, said something was circling his campsite. He sounded terrified. Mike, really terrified. Not like someone who's just spooked by normal forest sounds. I grabbed my flashlight and radio from the car, checking my service weapon out of habit. The Glock 22 felt reassuring in its holster, though I couldn't imagine what I might need to shoot at in a national forest. Any idea what we're dealing with? Could be a black bear? Maybe a cougar? Even as I asked the question, I knew it was wishful thinking. Sarah had been dealing with wildlife encounters for over a decade. She knew the difference between a bear and something unusual. Sarah shook her head emphatically. I've heard every sound these woods can make, Mike. Every mating call, every territorial dispute, every distress signal from every animal species in this region. This isn't natural, the way it echoes, the duration of the calls, the complexity of the vocalizations. It's like nothing I've ever encountered. And the camper, he said whatever it was, walked upright, said it was at least 8 feet tall and built like a linebacker, but covered in hair. He said it had hands. Mike, not paws, not claws, but actual hands with fingers. We started up the Hoh River Trail at 12:30 a.m., our flashlights cutting narrow beams through the thick darkness that seemed to swallow the light just a few feet ahead of us. The trail is well maintained during the day, a relatively easy hike that attracts thousands of visitors each year who come to see the famous Hall of Mosses and the massive old-growth trees that have been standing since before Columbus reached the Americas. But at night, it becomes a treacherous path of roots, rocks, and shadows that seem to move when you're not looking directly at them. Every step required careful attention, and more than once I found myself stumbling over obstacles that my flashlight had failed to illuminate properly. The sound of the Hoh River running alongside the trail should have been comforting, but tonight it felt ominous, like it was trying to mask other sounds in the forest. The constant rushing of water over rocks created a white noise that could easily hide the approach of something large moving through the underbrush. I found myself straining to hear beyond the river's voice, listening for the snap of a twig or the rustle of leaves that might indicate we weren't alone out here. Sarah led the way, her ranger training evident in how quietly she moved through the underbrush. She'd learned to walk in the forest the way her ancestors had, placing each foot carefully, testing the ground before committing her full weight, moving with a fluid grace that seemed almost supernatural in the darkness. I followed about 10 feet behind, my hand resting on my service weapon more out of nervous habit than any real expectation of needing it. My police training had taught me to be aware of my surroundings, to watch for potential threats, but nothing, in my experience, had prepared me for the feeling of being watched by something I couldn't see or identify. We'd been walking for about 20 minutes when we heard the first scream. It came from somewhere ahead of us, maybe half a mile up the trail, echoing through the forest like the cry of some primordial beast that had wandered out of humanity's oldest nightmares. The sound was unlike anything I'd ever heard in my 15 years of police work, and I'd heard plenty of disturbing sounds. I'd been to crime scenes where the victims were still alive and screaming. I'd heard the death rattles of overdose victims. I'd listened to the terrified cries of abuse victims calling for help. But this was different. This was something that seemed to come from outside the normal range of human or animal experience. The scream started low, almost like a growl, then rose to a piercing wail that seemed to go on forever. It had a quality that made your bones vibrate, a resonance that you felt in your chest as much as you heard with your ears. The sound echoed off the trees and canyon walls, making it impossible to pinpoint exactly where it was coming from, but what struck me most was the intelligence behind it. This wasn't the random cry of an animal in distress or the territorial call of a predator marking its territory. There was something deliberate about it, something almost communicative, as if whatever was making the sound was trying to convey a specific message to anyone who might be listening. Sarah stopped dead in her tracks, her flashlight beam wavering slightly as her hand trembled. "That's what I've been hearing for the past 2 hours," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the river, "but it's never been that close before, and it's never sounded that, intentional." She turned to look at me, and in the reflected glow of our flashlights, I could see that her face had gone pale. "Mike, I think whatever's making that sound knows we're here. I think it's calling to us." I keyed my radio to call for backup, but all I got was static. The thick canopy and the remote location made radio communication spotty at best, and tonight, it seemed like the forest itself was conspiring to cut us off from the outside world. We were on our own, 2 people with flashlights and a single service weapon, walking deeper into a wilderness that suddenly felt far more dangerous and mysterious than it had any right to be. "How much further to the camper?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady and professional despite the adrenaline that was starting to course through my system. "Maybe another mile," Sarah replied, her own voice tight with tension. "His site is near the old-growth grove, where the trail starts. To climb toward the glacier, it's a popular spot for experienced campers because it's far enough from the main trail to offer real solitude." Asterisk, as if on cue, another scream echoed through the forest, this one even closer than the first. The sound seemed to come from directly ahead of us, maybe a 1/4 mile up the trail, but this time, it was answered by another call from a different direction, somewhere off to our left in the deeper forest. The 2 sounds created a harmony that was both beautiful and terrifying, like a duet between creatures that existed outside the normal order of the natural world. Whatever was out there, we weren't dealing with just one of them. We were walking into the territory of something that lived in groups, something that communicated with its own kind, something that might be coordinating its movements in response to our presence. Asterisk, we found Tom Bradley's campsite at 1:15 a.m., but Tom was nowhere to be seen. His tent was still standing, a high-quality mountaineering model that could withstand hurricane-force winds. But the camp was in disarray that spoke of a hasty departure under stressful circumstances. His cooler had been overturned, though strangely, none of the food had been taken. Cans of beans and packages of freeze-dried meals were scattered around the site, but nothing had been opened or consumed. His camping chairs were scattered around the site as if they'd been knocked over by something large moving through the area, and there were deep gouges in the bark of nearby trees, too high and too wide to have been made by any known animal in the region. Asterisk, the gouges were the first piece of hard evidence that we were dealing with something unusual. I examined them carefully with my flashlight, trying to apply the same analytical approach I used at crime scenes. They were about 7 feet off the ground, which would put them well above the reach of even the largest black bear standing on its hind legs. Each mark was roughly 4 inches long and appeared to have been made by something with claws, but the spacing and depth suggested something much larger and more powerful than any predator native to the Pacific Northwest. The marks were fresh, probably made within the last few hours, and they showed a pattern that suggested deliberate action rather than random scratching. Asterisk, Tom, Sarah called out, her voice echoing through the trees. "Tom Bradley, this is Ranger Chen. Are you out there?" Her call was answered only by the sound of the river and the whisper of wind through the forest canopy. No response from Tom, but I had the distinct feeling that something else was listening to our voices, evaluating our presence, deciding how to respond to these intruders in its territory. Asterisk, I examined the gouges in the tree bark more closely, trying to understand what could have made them. The trees that had been marked were all Douglas firs with bark thick enough to require significant force to penetrate. Whatever had made these marks possessed not only the size to reach 7 feet up a tree trunk, but also the strength to drive claws deep into hardwood bark. The pattern of the marks suggested they had been made by a creature with 5 digits, each ending in a claw roughly 2 inches long. But the spacing between the marks was wrong for any known animal. Too wide for a bear, too large for a cougar, and showing a thumb placement that suggested an opposable digit. Asterisk, Sarah, look at this, I said, pointing my light at the ground near the overturned cooler. In the soft earth, illuminated by the beam of my flashlight, were footprints unlike anything I'd ever seen. They weren't bear tracks, which would have shown clear claw marks extending beyond the pad impressions. They weren't human footprints, which would have been much smaller and shown the distinctive arch and heel structure of modern shoes or bare feet. These were something in between, but massive beyond anything that should have been possible. Each print was at least 18 inches long and 8 inches wide, with clear impressions of 5 toes that showed a level of detail that would have been impossible to fake. The depth of the impressions suggested something that weighed at least 400 pounds, but the stride length between prints was enormous, at least 4 feet from heel to heel. Whatever had made these tracks was not only incredibly heavy, but also capable of covering ground with a gait that was more efficient than any known bipedal animal. The prints showed a midfoot flexibility that was distinctly ape-like, but the overall structure suggested something that was perfectly adapted for upright locomotion. I'd seen plenty of crime scenes in my career, analyzed evidence from everything from burglaries to homicides, but I'd never encountered physical evidence that challenged my understanding of what was possible in the natural world. These footprints represented something that shouldn't exist according to everything I'd been taught about North American wildlife. But here they were, pressed into the earth with a clarity that made denial impossible. We need to find Tom, Sarah said, her voice tight with worry. If he's hurt and hiding somewhere, or if whatever made these tracks is still in the area, ... She didn't need to finish the sentence. We both understood that we were potentially dealing with something dangerous, something that had already demonstrated its presence in Tom's campsite and might still be nearby. That's when we heard the breaking branches. Something large was moving through the forest, maybe 50 yards from our position. The sound was deliberate, methodical, like whatever was making it wasn't trying to hide its presence. In fact, it seemed to be moving directly toward us, crashing through the underbrush with a confidence that suggested this was its territory and we were the intruders. The sound grew closer, accompanied by what I can only describe as a low rumbling that seemed to come from deep within the chest of whatever was approaching. I drew my service weapon, though I wasn't sure what good a 9mm pistol would do against something that could leave claw marks 7 feet up, a tree trunk and footprints that suggested a weight of several hundred pounds. Stay behind me, I told Sarah, though I knew she was probably better equipped to handle whatever was out there than I was. She'd spent years dealing with dangerous wildlife, while my experience was limited to the occasional aggressive dog or drunken suspect. The breaking branches got closer, and then we saw the trees moving, not swaying in the wind, but actually being pushed aside by something moving through them. Something big enough to part the forest like a curtain, strong enough to snap branches that were several inches thick, and intelligent enough to choose a path that would bring it directly to our location. Whatever was coming toward us knew exactly where we were, and it was making a deliberate decision to confront us rather than avoid us. At 1:22 a.m., I saw something that changed my understanding of what's possible in this world. It emerged from between 2 massive Douglas firs about 30 yards from where Sarah and I were standing, moving with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for something so large. At first, all I could see was a dark silhouette against the slightly lighter darkness of the forest, but as it moved into a small clearing where the moonlight could reach it through a gap in the canopy, I got my first clear look at what we were dealing with. It stood at least 8.5 feet tall, possibly closer to 9 feet, with shoulders that were impossibly broad, maybe 4 feet across. Its entire body was covered in dark brown hair that seemed to shimmer in the moonlight, not the coarse fur of a bear or the fine hair of a human, but something in between that moved like water as the creature shifted its weight. Its arms hung down past its knees, ending in hands that were clearly visible in the moonlight, hands with long fingers and opposable thumbs that marked this as something far more advanced than any known animal. But what struck me most was how it moved. This wasn't some lumbering beast stumbling through the forest like the bears I'd encountered in my years of police work. It moved with purpose, with intelligence, scanning the area like it was assessing a situation. The way it held its head, the way it shifted its weight from foot to foot, the way it used its hands to part branches as it moved, everything about its behavior suggested a level of cognitive ability that was disturbingly human-like, just like a human would do when entering an unfamiliar situation. But this was definitely not human. The creature's head was massive, easily twice the size of a human head, with a pronounced brow ridge that cast deep shadows over its eyes. Its face was somehow both ape-like and disturbingly human, with features that seemed to represent an evolutionary path that diverged from our own millions of years ago but had arrived at some of the same solutions to the problems of intelligence and tool use. The nose was broad and flat, the mouth wide and expressive, and the overall facial structure suggested something that was capable of complex communication and emotional expression. When it turned to look in our direction, I saw its eyes reflect our flashlight beams like a cat's. But there was something behind those eyes that was unlike any animal I'd ever encountered. Intelligence, yes, but also awareness, curiosity, and what I can only describe as recognition. This creature wasn't just seeing us as potential threats or sources of food. It was studying us, trying to understand what we were and why we were in its territory. The look in its eyes was the same look you might see in the eyes of a scientist examining an interesting specimen, or a diplomat trying to assess the intentions of a foreign delegation. Jesus Christ, I whispered, forgetting every bit of police training I'd ever received. My hand was shaking so badly I could barely keep my weapon steady. Not that I had any intention of using it unless absolutely necessary. Everything about this creature's posture and behavior suggested that it was curious, rather than aggressive, and I had no desire to escalate a peaceful encounter into a violent confrontation. Besides, looking at the size and obvious strength of this being, I wasn't sure my service weapon would do anything more than annoy it if it decided to become hostile. The creature stood there for what felt like an eternity but was probably only 30 seconds, just watching us with those intelligent eyes. It tilted its head slightly, like a dog trying to understand a new sound, and I could see it processing information, making decisions, trying to figure out how to respond to our presence. Then it did something that will haunt me for the rest of my life. Something that removed any doubt about the intelligence we were dealing with. It raised one massive hand and pointed directly at me. Not at Sarah, not at our general location, but specifically at me. The gesture was unmistakably deliberate, unmistakably intelligent, and unmistakably directed. It had singled me out for some reason, recognized something about me that made me different from Sarah, or perhaps remembered me from some previous encounter that I wasn't aware of. The pointing gesture was accompanied by a soft vocalization, almost like a question, as if it was asking who I was or what I was doing there. Then it opened its mouth and let out another one of those screams. But this one was different from what we'd heard earlier, quieter, more controlled, with a tonal quality that suggested it was trying to communicate something specific rather than just announcing its presence. The sound had a musical quality to it, with variations in pitch and rhythm that reminded me of human speech patterns. As if this creature had its own language and was trying to use it to communicate with us. Sarah grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my jacket with enough force to leave bruises. "Mike, we need to back away slowly. Don't make any sudden movements." Her voice was barely a whisper, but I could hear the awe and terror competing in her tone. She was as amazed as I was by what we were witnessing, but she was also acutely aware that we were in the presence of something that could easily kill us if it chose to do so. But I couldn't move. I was transfixed by what I was seeing, hypnotized by the intelligence in those ancient eyes. This creature, this being, was studying us just as intently as we were studying it. There was a moment of connection, of mutual recognition between two intelligent species that transcended the barriers of language and evolution. For just a few seconds, I felt like I was looking into the eyes of a distant cousin, something that shared enough of our evolutionary history to be recognizable as kin, but had taken a different path through the millennia. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it turned and melted back into the forest. But it didn't crash through the underbrush like it had when approaching. Instead, it moved with a silence that seemed impossible for something so large, disappearing into the darkness like a shadow returning to the place where shadows are born. One moment it was there, solid and undeniable, and the next moment it was gone, leaving only the memory of those intelligent eyes and the lingering sense that we had just witnessed something that would change our understanding of the world forever. After the creature disappeared, Sarah and I stood in stunned silence for several minutes, neither of us quite able to process what we had just witnessed. My hands were still shaking, and I could hear my heart pounding in my ears like a drum that was out of rhythm with the rest of the world. In 15 years of police work, I'd never experienced anything that compared to the adrenaline rush of that encounter. I'd been in high-speed chases, armed standoffs, and life-threatening situations that required split-second decisions. But nothing had prepared me for the overwhelming sense of being in the presence of something that challenged everything I thought I knew about the natural world. But we still had a missing camper to find, and whatever that thing was, Tom Bradley might still be out there with it. The creature's behavior had seemed curious rather than aggressive, but that didn't mean it was harmless. Something that large and powerful could easily injure or kill a human being without intending to, and we had no way of knowing how it might react to a frightened camper who was trying to escape from its territory. We need to expand our search, I said, finally finding my voice. Tom could be anywhere in these woods. If he panicked and ran when he saw that thing, he could have gotten lost, injured himself, or worse. I was trying to think like a police officer again, to focus on the immediate problem of a missing person, rather than the larger implications of what we had just encountered. Sarah nodded, though I could see she was just as shaken as I was. There's an old logging road about half a mile north of here. If he was trying to get back to his truck, that's the route he'd most likely take. It's the most direct path back to the main trail, and it's wide enough that he wouldn't have to worry about getting lost in the underbrush. We spent the next hour searching the area around Tom's campsite, calling his name and following what we hoped were his footprints. But the forest floor was a maze of tracks from deer, elk, smaller animals, and those massive prints we'd found earlier. It was impossible to tell which direction Tom might have gone, or if he'd gone anywhere at all. For all we knew, he could be hiding somewhere nearby, too terrified to respond to our calls. Or he could be miles away, stumbling through the darkness, in a panic-induced flight from something his mind couldn't accept as real. Asterisk. The search was made more difficult by the constant feeling that we were being watched. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat. Every sound made us freeze and listen for signs of the creature's return. I found myself looking up into the trees, half expecting to see those intelligent eyes staring down at us from the canopy. The creature had demonstrated that it could move through the forest with complete silence when it chose to, which meant it could be anywhere. Observing our search efforts, deciding whether or not to reveal itself again. Asterisk. At 2:30 a.m., we heard a faint voice calling for help. It was coming from the direction of the old logging road Sarah had mentioned. Barely audible over the sound of the river and the whisper of wind through the trees. We followed the sound, moving as quickly as we dared through the dark forest, our flashlights sweeping back and forth as we tried to locate the source of the voice. Help! Is someone there? Please, I'm over here. The voice was definitely human, male, and filled with a desperation that spoke of hours spent in terror. We called back, identifying ourselves as police and park service, and followed the sound of Tom's responses until we found him about 20 minutes later. Asterisk. We found Tom Bradley huddled behind a fallen log about a quarter mile from his campsite, in a small depression that provided some protection from the wind but would have offered no defense against anything that really wanted to find him. He was conscious but clearly in shock, his clothes torn and dirty from running through the underbrush in the dark, his face scratched from low-hanging branches and thorns. His hands were shaking uncontrollably, and his eyes had the wide, staring look of someone who had seen something that his mind was struggling to process. Asterisk. Thank God, he said, when he saw our flashlights, his voice breaking with relief. I've been hiding here for hours. I didn't know if it was safe to move. Didn't know if that thing was still out there looking for me. He was a man in his 50s, an experienced outdoorsman who'd been camping in the Pacific Northwest for decades. But tonight he looked like he'd aged 10 years in the span of a few hours. Asterisk. Tom Bradley was not the kind of person who spooked easily. His truck had told the story of someone who spent serious time in the wilderness, and his camping gear was the expensive high-quality equipment that only comes from years of experience in challenging environments. This was a man who had probably faced down bears, survived storms that would send most people running for shelter, and navigated terrain that would challenge an experienced mountaineer. But tonight, he looked like he'd been through a psychological trauma that had shaken him to his core. Asterisk. What happened, Tom? Sarah asked, kneeling down beside him and speaking in the calm, reassuring tone she used with injured hikers. Tell us everything you remember. Take your time, and don't worry about how it sounds. We just need to know what you experienced. Asterisk. Tom took a shaky breath before he started talking, his voice barely above a whisper as he recounted the most terrifying night of his life. I was sitting by my campfire around 11 p.m., just enjoying the solitude and reading a book, when I heard something moving in the trees. At first I thought it might be a bear, so I started making noise, banging pots together, like you're supposed to do. But then I saw it standing at the edge of my campsite, just outside the circle of firelight, and I knew immediately that this wasn't any animal I'd ever encountered before. Asterisk. Tom Bradley's account of what happened at his campsite was both terrifying and strangely consistent with what Sarah and I had just witnessed. As he told his story, speaking in the halting, disjointed manner of someone trying to describe an experience that challenged his understanding of reality, I found myself believing every word despite how impossible it all seemed. There was a sincerity in his voice, an attention to detail that spoke of someone trying very hard to be accurate rather than dramatic. That convinced me he was telling the truth as he understood it. Asterisk. It was huge, Tom said, his voice still shaking with the memory. At least 8 feet tall, maybe taller. I'm 6'2" myself, and this thing would have towered over me. It was covered in dark hair, but it walked upright like a person. The way it moved, though, it was too graceful for something that big, too quiet. When it walked, I could barely hear its footsteps, even though it had to weigh at least 400 or 500 pounds. Asterisk. Tom described how the creature had circled his campsite for what felt like hours, staying just at the edge of the firelight where he could see its silhouette but couldn't make out details. He said it never approached directly, but he could feel it watching him, studying him, trying to understand what he was and why he was in its territory. The creature's behavior was methodical, almost scientific, as if it was conducting its own investigation of this human intruder. Asterisk. The scariest part wasn't its size or the way it looked, Tom continued, his voice gaining strength as he worked through the memory. It was the intelligence. This thing was thinking, planning, making decisions. When I tried to pack up my gear and leave, it would move to block my path to the trail. Not aggressively, not threatening, but definitely deliberate. Like it knew exactly what I was trying to do and was preventing me from doing it. Asterisk. According to Tom, the creature had demonstrated a level of problem-solving ability that was distinctly human-like. When he'd tried to use his cell phone to call for help, the creature had moved closer to his campsite, as if it understood that the device represented some form of communication with the outside world. When he'd attempted to build up his fire to create more light, the creature had retreated slightly, suggesting that it understood the relationship between fire and visibility. Asterisk, it was learning, Tom said, his eyes wide with the memory. Every time I did something, it would watch and then adjust its own behavior accordingly. Like it was figuring out how I worked, what my capabilities were, what my limitations might be. I've never felt so thoroughly studied by anything in my life. Asterisk, the most disturbing part of Tom's account was his description of the creature's attempts at communication. He said that throughout the night, it had made various sounds, not the screams that Sarah and I had heard, but quieter vocalizations that seemed directed specifically at him. Soft hooting sounds, low rumbles, and what he described as almost like words, but in a language I'd never heard before. Asterisk, at one point, around 1 a.m., it came closer to the fire than it had before, Tom said. Close enough that I could see its face clearly. It looked at me for maybe 5 minutes, just staring, and then it pointed at me and made this sound. Not threatening, not aggressive, but definitely trying to communicate something. It was like it was asking me a question, or trying to tell me something important. Asterisk, Tom's description of the creature's physical appearance matched exactly what Sarah and I had witnessed. The massive size, the broad shoulders, the long arms, the intelligent eyes, everything was consistent down to the smallest details. But Tom had observed the creature for much longer than we had, and his account provided insights into its behavior that we hadn't had time to notice. The hands were the most human-like thing about it, Tom said. Long fingers, opposable thumbs, and it used them like tools. I saw it pick up a stick and use it to poke at my campfire, testing the heat. I saw it examine my camping gear, touching things carefully like it was trying to understand what they were for. This wasn't random animal behavior. This was intelligent investigation. Asterisk, according to Tom. The creature had eventually let out one of those piercing screams that Sarah and I had heard, and that's when he'd panicked and run into the forest. I'd been holding it together pretty well up to that point, he said. But when it screamed like that, something primal in my brain just took over. All I could think about was getting away, putting as much distance as possible between me and that thing. Asterisk, he'd been hiding behind the fallen log ever since. Too terrified to move and too afraid to call out for help until he heard our voices. I've been camping in these woods for 30 years, Tom said, his voice gaining conviction as he spoke. I know every animal that lives here, every sound they make, every way they behave. This wasn't a bear, wasn't a cougar, wasn't anything I've ever seen before, but it was real as you and me sitting here right now. Asterisk, I looked at Sarah, and I could see in her eyes that she was thinking the same thing I was. Tom's description matched exactly what we'd encountered, down to details that would have been impossible to fabricate or guess. The size, the intelligence, the way it moved, the way it communicated, everything was consistent. We weren't dealing with 3 separate incidents or mass hysteria. We were dealing with something that defied explanation, something that challenged everything we thought we knew about the natural world. Asterisk, Tom, we need to get you back to the ranger station, I said, helping him to his feet. You should see a doctor, make sure you're not injured, and then we need to document everything you've told us. But as we helped Tom gather his scattered belongings and started back down the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every shadow seemed to move, every breaking branch made us all freeze and listen. Whatever was out there, I had the distinct impression it wasn't done with us yet. Asterisk, by the time we got Tom Bradley back to the ranger station, it was nearly 4 a.m. The eastern sky was just beginning to show the first faint hints of dawn, and the forest was starting to come alive with the sounds of early morning birds. Tom called his wife to let her know he was safe, though he didn't go into details about what had happened. Sarah made arrangements for him to stay in town for the night rather than drive back to Portland in his current state, and I began the process of documenting what we'd experienced. Asterisk, but I couldn't let this go. I'd seen something that challenged everything I thought I knew about the world, and as a police officer, I needed evidence. Personal testimony, no matter how credible, wouldn't be enough to convince anyone of what we'd encountered. I needed physical proof, something that could be measured, photographed, and analyzed by people who hadn't been there to witness the impossible. Asterisk, Sarah, I want to go back up there at first light, I said as we sat in the ranger station, drinking coffee and trying to process what we'd experienced. We need to document everything, the footprints, the claw marks, the campsite. If we're going to report this, we need proof that can't be dismissed or explained away. Asterisk, Sarah nodded, though I could see the exhaustion in her eyes. I was thinking the same thing. But Mike, who are we going to report this to? What are we going to say? That we encountered Bigfoot in the Olympic National Forest. She had a point that I'd been trying not to think about. In my 15 years as a cop, I'd written thousands of reports, but I'd never had to document an encounter with a cryptid. How do you explain something like this in official police language? How do you maintain credibility when you're describing something that most people believe is just a myth? Asterisk, we went back to the forest at dawn, armed with cameras, measuring tape, and plaster for making casts of the footprints. The morning light revealed details we'd missed in the darkness, and what we found was even more compelling than what we'd observed the night before. The claw marks on the trees were even more impressive in daylight, deep gouges that would have required incredible strength to make, positioned at heights that ruled out any known animal in the region. Asterisk, the footprints were still clear in the soft earth around Tom's campsite, and we made detailed measurements and photographs of each one. The prints showed a level of anatomical detail that would have been nearly impossible to fake toe prints. Arch structure, heel impressions, and even what appeared to be dermal ridges similar to human fingerprints. We made plaster casts of the 3 clearest prints, documenting the process with photographs to establish a clear chain of evidence. Asterisk, but the most compelling evidence was something we almost missed. About 50 yards from Tom's campsite, Sarah found a tuft of dark brown hair caught on a broken branch about 7 feet off the ground. The hair was coarse and thick, unlike anything from any known animal in the region, and it was positioned at exactly the height where the creature's shoulder would have been as it moved through the forest. Asterisk, we carefully collected the hair sample in an evidence bag, treating it with the same care we would use for evidence in a criminal investigation. The hair was clearly fresh, probably deposited within the last 12 hours, and it showed characteristics that were unlike any animal hair I'd ever seen. It was too coarse to be human, but it had a structure that suggested a highly evolved primate species. Asterisk, as we worked, documenting everything with the thoroughness of a crime scene investigation, I kept expecting to feel foolish, to start doubting what we'd seen in the darkness. But the evidence was undeniable. Something large and unknown had been in these woods, and it had left behind proof of its existence that couldn't be explained away by conventional science. Asterisk, we also found additional footprints leading away from Tom's campsite, heading deeper into the forest toward areas that were rarely visited by humans. The trail was intermittent, visible only where the creature had stepped in soft earth or mud, but it was clear enough to follow for several hundred yards before disappearing into rocky terrain, where tracks wouldn't be preserved. Asterisk, the footprint trail told a story of its own. The stride length and depth of the impressions suggested that the creature had been moving at a normal walking pace, rather than running or fleeing. It had left Tom's campsite deliberately, following a specific route that suggested familiarity with the terrain. This wasn't a random animal wandering through the forest. This was an intelligent being that knew exactly where it was going and why. Asterisk, we spent 4 hours documenting everything we could find, taking hundreds of photographs and making detailed notes about every piece of evidence. By the time we finished, we had assembled a collection of physical proof that would be difficult for anyone to dismiss. The footprints alone represented evidence of something that shouldn't exist according to conventional zoology, but when combined with the hair sample, the claw marks, and the testimony of 3 credible witnesses, it painted a picture of an encounter with an unknown species that demanded serious scientific investigation. Asterisk, back at the station, I faced the most difficult decision of my career. Do I file an official report about what we'd encountered, knowing it could damage my credibility and potentially end my career? Or do I keep quiet and pretend it never happened, allowing the most significant discovery of my lifetime to disappear into the bureaucratic void of unspoken truths? Asterisk, I chose to document everything. I spent the entire morning writing a detailed incident report, including Tom Bradley's statement, Sarah Chen's observations, and my own first-hand account of the encounter. I attached photographs of all the evidence we'd collected, detailed measurements of the footprints, and a complete timeline of events from the initial call to our return to the ranger station. I submitted it all to my supervisor, Captain Robert Hayes, along with a request for the hair sample to be sent to the state crime lab for analysis. Asterisk, Captain Hayes has been with the department for 25 years. He's seen everything from serial killers to drug cartels, investigated cases that would give most people nightmares, and dealt with situations that would challenge the sanity of anyone with less experience. Nothing much surprises him anymore, and he has a reputation for being able to handle any situation with calm professionalism. But when he called me into his office after reading my report, I could see he was struggling with how to handle this unprecedented situation. Asterisk, Mike, I've known you for 8 years, he said, leaning back in his chair and studying me with the kind of intense scrutiny usually reserved for suspects in major crimes. You're one of the most level-headed officers I've ever worked with. You don't make things up, you don't exaggerate, and you sure as hell don't file false reports. Your arrest record is solid, your testimony in court is unshakable, and you've never given me reason to doubt your judgment, so I'm inclined to believe that you saw something out there. The question is, what do we do about it? We discussed the options available to us, and none of them were particularly appealing. We could forward the report to the FBI, though they'd probably file it away in some basement archive and forget about it. We could contact local universities with anthropology or zoology departments, but they'd likely dismiss it as an elaborate hoax or the product of overactive imaginations. We could keep it internal and hope that documenting it officially would be enough to satisfy our professional obligations, but that would mean potentially suppressing evidence of the most significant zoological discovery in modern history. Asterisk, there's another option, Captain Hayes said after we'd exhausted the conventional possibilities. There's a researcher at the University of Washington, Dr. Elizabeth Morrison. She's a primatologist who's been studying reports of unknown hominids in the Pacific Northwest for years. She's published papers on the subject, though they've been largely ignored by the mainstream scientific community. She might be interested in what you found, and she'd have the credentials to give your evidence the kind of scientific analysis it deserves. That afternoon, I called Dr. Morrison and arranged to meet with her the following day. I brought copies of all our evidence, the photographs, the measurements, the hair sample, and the detailed statements from all three witnesses. I also brought my own skepticism and a healthy dose of professional paranoia. For all I knew, Dr. Morrison could be one of those fringe researchers who sees Bigfoot behind every tree and would be willing to validate any evidence, no matter how questionable, that supported her theories. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison was younger than I'd expected, probably in her early 40s, with the kind of intense focus that comes from years of academic research combined with the frustration of working in a field that most of her colleagues considered pseudoscience. Her office at the University of Washington was filled with books, research papers, and plaster casts of footprints from around the world. She'd been studying reports of unknown primates for over 15 years, and she approached our evidence with the kind of scientific rigor I'd hoped for. She listened to our story without interruption, occasionally taking notes, but never showing the kind of skepticism or disbelief I'd expected from an academic. When I finished recounting our experience, she asked detailed questions about the creature's behavior, its physical characteristics, and the environmental conditions during our encounter. Her questions were specific and informed, suggesting a deep understanding of primate behavior and the challenges of documenting unknown species. The hair sample is particularly interesting, she said, examining it under a high-powered microscope in her laboratory. The structure is unlike any known primate species in North America. It's too coarse to be human, but it shows characteristics that suggest a highly evolved hominid. The medulla structure is consistent with what we might expect from a large, cold-adapted primate, and the pigmentation suggests an animal that spends most of its time in forested environments. She measured our photographs of the footprints against casts she'd collected from other reported encounters throughout the Pacific Northwest. The size and proportions are consistent with other credible sightings in the region. The toe placement, the arch structure, the way the weight is distributed, these aren't easily faked, and they show anatomical features that would require extensive knowledge of primate locomotion to fabricate convincingly. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison's approach to our evidence was everything I'd hoped for from the scientific community. She examined each piece of physical proof with the kind of methodical analysis that reminded me of the best crime scene investigators I'd worked with, looking for details that might support or contradict our account of what we'd experienced. Her laboratory was equipped with instruments I'd never seen before, devices that could analyze hair structure at the molecular level and compare footprint measurements against databases of known primate species from around the world. The problem with cryptid research, she explained as she worked, is that the scientific community has largely dismissed the possibility of unknown hominids existing in North America. It's considered career suicide to take these reports seriously, which means that most of the evidence is never properly analyzed. Researchers who express interest in the subject find their funding cut, their papers rejected, and their reputations damaged. The result is that we have decades of accumulated evidence that has never been subjected to rigorous scientific scrutiny. She showed me files of other encounters, many involving law enforcement officers, park rangers, and other credible witnesses, whose professional reputations depended on accurate observation and truthful reporting. The descriptions were remarkably consistent across different time periods and geographical locations. Large bipedal creatures covered in hair, displaying intelligence and awareness far beyond any known animal, and showing behavioral patterns that suggested a complex social structure. What you encountered fits the pattern perfectly, Dr. Morrison said, comparing our evidence against data she'd been collecting for over a decade. The size, the behavior, the physical evidence, it all matches what we've been documenting for years. The question is, what are we dealing with? A surviving population of Gigantopithecus that somehow made it to North America? An unknown branch of human evolution that diverged from our lineage millions of years ago? Something else entirely that we haven't even considered. The hair analysis was particularly revealing. Under microscopic examination, the samples showed structural characteristics that were unlike any known North American mammal. The medulla, or central core of each hair, had a pattern that was consistent with large primates, but with features that suggested adaptation to cold climates and dense forest environments. The cuticle structure showed where patterns that indicated the hair came from an animal that spent significant time moving through thick vegetation. Most importantly, Dr. Morrison said, the hair shows no signs of artificial treatment or modification. This isn't from a costume or a hoax. This is biological material from a living animal, and it's unlike anything in our current taxonomic classifications. She agreed to have the hair sample analyzed by a colleague at a private laboratory, someone who specialized in genetic analysis of unknown specimens and who had the equipment necessary to extract and sequence DNA from small samples. The process would take several weeks, but she was optimistic that we might finally have the genetic evidence needed to prove what many researchers had suspected for decades. If we can get a clean DNA sequence, she explained, we can determine exactly where this species fits in the primate family tree. We can establish its relationship to humans, to other great apes, and to extinct hominid species. We might finally have the proof we need to force the scientific community to take these reports seriously. But Dr. Morrison also warned me about the challenges we would face in getting our evidence accepted by mainstream science. Even with DNA proof, there will be skeptics who claim the samples were contaminated or fabricated. The scientific establishment has invested too much credibility in the position that unknown hominids don't exist in North America. Admitting they were wrong would require acknowledging that they've been dismissing legitimate evidence for decades. She also explained the broader implications of what we'd discovered. If these creatures exist, and if they're as intelligent as your encounter suggests, then we're dealing with a species that has managed to avoid scientific detection for centuries. That level of elusiveness requires not just intelligence, but sophisticated understanding of human behavior and technology. We might be looking at a species that is deliberately hiding from us, that has learned to avoid contact with humans as a survival strategy. The possibility that we were dealing with an intelligent species that was actively avoiding human contact raised ethical questions that I hadn't considered. If these creatures existed, did they have rights? Were we obligated to protect their privacy and their territory? What would happen if their existence became public knowledge and their habitats were invaded by researchers, tourists, and thrill seekers? That's why documentation is so important, Dr. Morrison said. If we can prove they exist through scientific evidence, we can also work to protect them from exploitation. But first, we need to convince the scientific community that they're real. 3 weeks after our initial encounter, Dr. Morrison asked if I would guide her back to the site where we'd seen the creature. She wanted to conduct a more thorough investigation, using equipment that wasn't available during our first visit. Sarah Chen agreed to join us, along with 2 of Dr. Morrison's graduate students, who specialized in wildlife tracking and audio analysis. The team included Marcus Chen, a doctoral candidate in animal behavior who had spent years studying primate communication patterns, and Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a postdoctoral researcher whose expertise in forensic anthropology had proven invaluable in analyzing footprint evidence from previous expeditions. We returned to the Olympic National Forest on a crisp November morning, armed with motion-activated cameras, audio recording equipment, ground-penetrating radar to search for any underground dens or shelters the creatures might be using, and spectrographic analysis equipment that could break down vocalizations into component frequencies. The scientific equipment filled 2 large backpacks and represented technology that was normally used in major research expeditions to study endangered species in remote locations. The forest felt different in daylight, less ominous, but somehow more mysterious. The autumn colors were at their peak, with the maple and alder trees creating a canopy of gold and red that filtered the sunlight into a warm, ethereal glow. But beneath the beauty, I could sense something watching us, evaluating. Our return to this remote corner of the wilderness, we set up a base camp near Tom Bradley's original campsite and began a systematic search of the surrounding area, using GPS coordinates to map every piece of evidence we discovered. Within hours, we found additional evidence that convinced Dr. Morrison we were dealing with a resident population rather than a single transient individual. More footprints, though these were older and less distinct than the ones we'd found 3 weeks earlier, suggested that multiple individuals used this area regularly. Tree breaks at heights that would require incredible strength to achieve work, scattered throughout a roughly 10 square mile area, indicating either a single, very active individual or a small group that regularly traveled through this territory. Most intriguingly, we discovered what appeared to be a crude shelter made from broken branches and moss, hidden in a dense thicket about half a mile from the main trail. The structure was approximately 8 feet long and 4 feet wide, positioned to take advantage of natural windbreaks, and camouflaged so effectively that we almost walked past it without noticing. The construction showed clear intelligence and planning, with branches woven together in a pattern that would provide maximum protection from rain and wind while remaining virtually invisible to casual observation. This is remarkable, said Dr. Morrison, examining the shelter with the kind of excitement I'd seen in her laboratory when she'd first analyzed our hair sample. The construction shows clear intelligence and planning. This isn't random animal behavior like a bear's day bed or a deer's resting spot. This is deliberate architecture, designed to meet specific environmental challenges. The positioning takes advantage of natural drainage patterns to avoid flooding. The entrance faces away from prevailing winds, and the materials are selected for their insulating properties. We set up motion-activated cameras around the shelter and in several other locations where we'd found evidence of regular activity. The plan was to monitor the area for several weeks, hoping to capture video evidence of whatever was living in these woods. The cameras were equipped with infrared sensors that could detect heat signatures in complete darkness, and they were programmed to begin recording at the slightest indication of movement larger than a small rodent. Marcus Chen set up his audio recording equipment at strategic points throughout our surveillance network, creating a grid of sensitive microphones that could detect and triangulate the source of any vocalizations in the area. The equipment was sophisticated enough to filter out normal forest sounds like wind, running water, and known animal calls, focusing instead on anomalous sounds that might indicate the presence of unknown species. On our second night in the forest, we got more than we bargained for. I was on watch duty around 2 a.m., monitoring the camera feeds on Dr. Morrison's laptop and listening to the audio equipment through headphones that allowed me to hear sounds from across our entire surveillance network. The forest was alive with the normal sounds of nocturnal activity, owls calling, small mammals moving through the underbrush, the distant howl of coyotes from a neighboring valley. Then, at 2:17 a.m., camera number 3 was triggered. The motion sensor sent an alert to my phone, and I quietly woke the others as we watched on Dr. Morrison's laptop screen. A massive dark figure moved through the frame, clearly bipedal and enormous, but visible for only a few seconds before disappearing back into the forest. More importantly, it seemed to be examining the camera itself, reaching up to touch the device with what appeared to be a massive hand. It knows we're here, whispered Sarah, her voice filled with the same mixture of excitement and apprehension I was feeling. It knows we're watching, and it's investigating our equipment just like we're investigating its territory. The creature's behavior was methodical and curious rather than aggressive or territorial. It approached each camera location over the course of the next hour, spending time examining the devices, and in some cases, actually repositioning them to get better angles of our camp. The intelligence displayed in these actions was undeniable. This was not random animal behavior, but deliberate investigation by something that understood the purpose of our equipment and was conducting its own surveillance of our activities. What happened next was unlike anything I'd experienced in my law enforcement career, and it challenged every assumption I'd made about the nature of intelligence and communication in the animal kingdom. Over the next 4 hours, we recorded activity on multiple cameras throughout our surveillance network, documenting behavior that suggested not just intelligence, but sophisticated understanding of human technology and intentions. The creatures, and it was clear there was more than one, seemed to be conducting their own investigation of our equipment and our presence in their territory. They approached each camera location with obvious caution, spent time examining the devices from multiple angles, and in several cases, manipulated the cameras to change their field of view. The behavior was so methodical and purposeful that it reminded me of crime scene investigators documenting evidence, except that in this case, we were the evidence being documented. They're studying us, Dr. Morrison said, her voice filled with excitement and apprehension as we watched the feeds from multiple cameras simultaneously. This level of curiosity and problem-solving ability is unprecedented in any known primate species. They're not just aware of our presence, they're actively investigating us, trying to understand our technology and our intentions. Marcus Chen was frantically taking notes as his audio equipment picked up vocalizations from multiple directions. Throughout the forest, the sounds were complex, with variations in tone and rhythm that suggested a form of structured communication. There's definitely a pattern here, he said, his voice tight with concentration as he tried to analyze the sounds in real time. These aren't random calls or simple emotional expressions. They're structure, repetition, response patterns. This could be actual language, a sophisticated communication system that allows for complex information exchange. The vocalizations seem to be coordinated with the visual investigation of our equipment. When one individual discovered a camera, it would emit a specific call that would be answered by others from different locations. The response calls had variations that seemed to convey different types of information, location, status, possibly even descriptions of what had been found. The complexity of the communication suggested a level of cognitive development that was far beyond what mainstream science believed possible for any unknown primate species. Around 4 a.m. Something extraordinary happened that changed the nature of our expedition. One of the creatures approached our camp directly, moving with deliberate purpose rather than the cautious investigation we'd observed earlier. We could see it on camera, number 1, positioned about 50 yards from our tents, standing at the edge of the clearing where our camp lights created a boundary between the known and the unknown. The creature was even larger than the one I'd encountered 3 weeks earlier, easily 9 feet tall with massive shoulders and arms that suggested incredible physical strength. But what struck me most was its posture and behavior. It wasn't aggressive or threatening, despite its obvious physical advantages. Instead, it seemed curious, almost respectful, like a diplomat approaching a foreign embassy to establish contact between two different nations. It stood at the edge of our light for several minutes, clearly visible but making no move to approach closer. Then it called out in a softer, more controlled tone than we'd heard before, a vocalization that seemed directed specifically at our camp rather than at other members of its species. The sound had a questioning quality, as if it was asking for permission to approach or trying to determine our intentions. Dr. Morrison made a decision that was either brilliant or incredibly dangerous, depending on your perspective. She stepped out of her tent, moving slowly and deliberately to avoid any actions that might be interpreted as threatening, and called back to the creature. She tried to mimic the tone and rhythm of its vocalization, using her knowledge of primate communication to attempt a response that might be interpreted as peaceful and non-threatening. The forest went completely silent. For several minutes, nothing moved, nothing made a sound, as if the entire ecosystem was holding its breath to see what would happen next. Then, slowly and deliberately, the creature stepped into the edge of our light, revealing itself more completely than any of these beings had ever been documented before. It was magnificent and terrifying at the same time, a living embodiment of humanity's oldest legends and deepest fears. The creature stood upright with perfect balance, its massive frame covered in dark brown hair that seemed to absorb and reflect the light simultaneously. Its face was a mixture of human and ape characteristics, with intelligent eyes that reflected our camp lights and showed an awareness that was unmistakably conscious and deliberate. The creature and Dr. Morrison stood there looking at each other for what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few minutes. Then, incredibly, the creature raised one massive hand in what could only be described as a greeting, a gesture so human-like and intentional that it removed any doubt about the intelligence we were dealing with. Dr. Morrison, showing courage that bordered on recklessness, raised her hand in response, establishing the first documented peaceful contact between humans and an unknown hominid species. The exchange between Dr. Morrison and the creature lasted only a few minutes, but it represented a breakthrough in our understanding of these beings that was more significant than any previous cryptozoological research. The creature seemed to understand that Dr. Morrison was trying to communicate, and it responded with a series of soft vocalizations that were clearly directed at her, creating a primitive but unmistakable dialogue between two intelligent species. It's trying to talk to me, she whispered, never taking her eyes off the massive figure at the edge of our camp. The tonal variations, the pauses for response, the way it's watching my reactions, this is definitely intentional communication. This creature has language, and it's trying to use it to establish contact with us. The creature gestured to the forest and back at our camp, then at Dr. Morrison herself, using hand movements that were remarkably human-like in their expressiveness. The meaning seemed clear. It was asking about our presence, our intentions, our purpose in its territory. The gestures were accompanied by vocalizations that had the rhythm and inflection of questions, suggesting that this species had developed not just language, but the concept of inquiry and information exchange. Dr. Morrison tried to respond with gestures of her own, pointing to herself, then to the forest, then making what she hoped were peaceful, non-threatening movements. She spoke softly in English, knowing the creature wouldn't understand the words but hoping that her tone and body language would convey her peaceful intentions. The creature watched intently, its head tilted slightly as if trying to understand not just her gestures, but the underlying meaning behind them. Then the creature did something that sent chills down my spine and confirmed that we were dealing with intelligence that was far more sophisticated than we'd imagined. It pointed directly at me, just as the other creature had done 3 weeks earlier. But this time it followed the gesture with a series of vocalizations that sounded almost like questions. The creature had not only recognized me from our previous encounter, but had somehow communicated this recognition to other members of its species. I think it recognizes you, Dr. Morrison said, her voice filled with amazement. It knows you were here before, and it's asking about you specifically. This suggests not just individual memory, but social communication about encounters with humans. They're sharing information about us within their community. Slowly, carefully, I stepped out of my tent and into the light. My movements deliberate and non-threatening. The creature's attention focused on me immediately, and I could see recognition in its eyes that was unmistakably personal. This wasn't just a general awareness of humans as a species. This creature remembered me as an individual, remembered our previous encounter, and was making a conscious decision to approach me again. The creature made a soft sound, almost like a greeting, and I found myself responding with a quiet hello, feeling somewhat foolish but compelled to acknowledge its attempt at communication. The creature's head tilted again, and it repeated the sound I'd made, but with its own vocal inflection and tonal quality. It was trying to learn our language, attempting to bridge the communication gap between our species through imitation and adaptation. Marcus Chen was recording everything, his equipment capturing not just the sounds but the frequency patterns and harmonic structures that might provide insights into how this species' vocal communication system worked. This is incredible, he whispered, his voice tight with excitement. The creature is demonstrating vocal learning, the ability to modify its vocalizations based on auditory input. This is a cognitive ability that's found in only the most intelligent species, humans, some cetaceans, and a few bird species. It suggests a level of neural development that's far beyond what we'd expect from an unknown primate. After several more minutes of this extraordinary exchange, the creature stepped back into the darkness, but before it disappeared completely, it made one final gesture that will remain with me for the rest of my life. It placed its massive hand over its heart, then extended it toward us, a movement so clearly intentional and symbolic that its meaning transcended the barriers of language and evolution. Even without a common vocabulary, the gesture was unmistakable. It was offering friendship, or at least peaceful coexistence between our species. As the creature melted back into the forest with the same silent grace we'd observed before, Dr. Morrison and I stood in stunned silence, trying to process what we'd just experienced. We'd just documented first contact with an unknown intelligent species, and it had been peaceful, curious, and remarkably human-like in its desire to communicate and establish understanding. We need to document everything, Dr. Morrison said, her scientific training taking over even as she struggled to process the emotional impact of what we'd witnessed. Every gesture, every vocalization, every detail of the interaction, this could be the most important interspecies communication event in human history. But even as we began the process of documenting our encounter, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. We had made contact with a species that had successfully hidden from human science for centuries, and our presence here represented a potential threat to their continued secrecy and safety. The creature's peaceful approach suggested trust, but it also represented a vulnerability that could be exploited by less ethical researchers or by commercial interests that might see these beings as opportunities for profit rather than as fellow inhabitants of our planet. When we returned to civilization with our evidence, hours of video footage showing clear interactions with unknown hominids, audio recordings of apparent language and communication attempts, and documented peaceful contact between our species, I expected the scientific community to be excited, possibly even revolutionary in their response. Instead, we encountered skepticism, ridicule, and what appeared to be active suppression of our findings by institutions that should have been most interested in groundbreaking discoveries. Dr. Morrison submitted our evidence to several peer-reviewed journals, including Nature, Science, and the American Journal of Primatology, but all of them rejected our papers without proper review. The rejections came with form letters that cited insufficient evidence and failure to meet publication standards. Despite the fact that our documentation was more thorough and scientifically rigorous than most field studies that were routinely published in these same journals. The hair sample analysis came back with results that were described as inconclusive and contaminated, despite being handled with proper chain of custody procedures and analyzed by laboratories that specialized in genetic analysis of unknown specimens. The DNA sequences that were extracted showed characteristics that didn't match any known species, but rather than being celebrated as evidence of a new discovery, they were dismissed as contamination or laboratory error. Most disturbing of all, I was called into a meeting with federal agents who claimed to be from the Fish and Wildlife Service but carried credentials I couldn't verify and displayed knowledge of our expedition that suggested they had been monitoring our activities from the beginning. The meeting took place in a nondescript office building in downtown Seattle, in a room that had no windows and felt more like an interrogation chamber than a government office. Officer Harrison, said the lead agent, a stern woman in her 50s, who introduced herself only as Agent Thompson. We understand you've been conducting unauthorized research in a protected federal forest. This needs to stop immediately. Her tone was professional but carried an underlying threat that made it clear this wasn't a request but a demand backed by federal authority. They confiscated our video footage, claiming it was evidence in an ongoing investigation into illegal camping and research activities in protected wilderness areas. They also seized our audio recordings, our photographic evidence, and even our field notes, leaving us with nothing but our memories and the growing realization that we had stumbled into something that powerful people wanted to keep hidden. There are no unknown species in the Olympic National Forest, Agent Thompson said firmly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who is used to having her statements accepted without question. What you encountered were black bears, possibly suffering from mange or other conditions that altered their appearance. Any suggestion otherwise is not only scientifically irresponsible but potentially dangerous to public safety. The agents made it clear that any further discussion of our findings could result in federal charges related to interfering with protected wildlife habitats, conducting unauthorized research in national forests, and potentially even charges related to national security if we continued to publicize what they characterized as unsubstantiated claims about unknown species. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Continue this research and face the full weight of federal prosecution. Dr. Morrison was threatened with loss of her research funding and tenure if she continued to pursue this line of investigation. Her department chair at the University of Washington called her into a meeting the day after our encounter with the federal agents, informing her that her research grant had been reassessed and that her focus needed to return to more conventional primatology research. Her graduate students were reassigned to other projects, and her access to university resources was restricted pending a review of research protocols. Within a month, it was as if our entire investigation had never happened. The official records of our expedition were classified or destroyed, our evidence was confiscated, and the people who had participated in the research were either silenced through threats or discredited through professional pressure. The scientific establishment closed ranks to protect the conventional wisdom that unknown hominids didn't exist in North America, regardless of the evidence to the contrary. But I knew what I'd seen, I knew what we'd documented. And I knew that, somewhere in the Olympic National Forest, there was an intelligent species that had tried to communicate with us, only to be denied existence by the very institutions that should have been most interested in studying and protecting them. The official report I'd filed was buried in departmental archives, classified as unsubstantiated wildlife encounter, and sealed from public access. Captain Hayes was transferred to another precinct within 2 weeks of our return, officially, as part of a departmental reorganization, but clearly as punishment for supporting my investigation. I was strongly encouraged to focus on more traditional police work and to avoid any further involvement in fringe research activities that might reflect poorly on the department's reputation. The message was clear. The truth about these creatures was too dangerous to be acknowledged publicly, too disruptive to established scientific and governmental interests to be allowed into the mainstream discourse. Whatever these beings were, wherever they came from, their existence was a secret that powerful people were determined to keep, regardless of the implications for our understanding of evolution, intelligence, and our place in the natural world. 6 months have passed since our encounter in the Olympic National Forest, and I have tried to return to normal police work. But the experience has changed me in ways that make it impossible to go back to the way things were before. I can't forget what I saw, what I experienced, what I learned about the world we live in, and the forces that control what we're allowed to know about it. There are things in our forests that science refuses to acknowledge, beings that have learned to avoid human contact, but still occasionally reveal themselves to those who venture deep enough into their domain. I've continued to investigate on my own time, following up on reports from other law enforcement officers, park rangers, and civilians who've had similar encounters. The pattern is always the same: initial excitement and attempts to document the experience, followed by official dismissal, evidence that disappears or is discredited, and witnesses who are encouraged to keep quiet through a combination of professional pressure and subtle threats. But the truth has a way of persisting, even when powerful forces try to suppress it. I've discovered a network of researchers, scientists, and law enforcement professionals who have had similar experiences and who continue to investigate these phenomena despite the professional risks involved. We communicate through encrypted channels, share information carefully, and document everything with the understanding that official channels are compromised. Tom Bradley has returned to camping, but never alone and never in the Olympic National Forest. He's become an advocate for the protection of wilderness areas, though he's careful never to mention the real reason for his passion. He started a blog about outdoor safety that has attracted thousands of followers, and he uses it to subtly educate people about the importance of respecting the unknown inhabitants of our wild spaces. Sarah Chen continues her work as a park ranger, but she's installed motion-activated cameras throughout her patrol area, hoping to capture evidence that can't be confiscated or dismissed. She's also begun documenting unusual reports from hikers and campers, creating an unofficial database of encounters that might someday provide the evidence needed to force official acknowledgement of these creatures' existence. Dr. Morrison lost her university position, but she continues her research through private funding provided by individuals who understand the importance of her work. She's building a network of scientists and researchers around the world who believe the evidence is too compelling to ignore, and she's developing new methodologies for studying cryptid species that might allow for documentation without endangering the creatures or the researchers. As for me, I've learned that being a police officer sometimes means protecting truths that society isn't ready to accept. I've seen intelligence in those ancient eyes, witnessed peaceful contact with a species that has every reason to fear and avoid humanity, and experienced communication that transcended the barriers of language and evolution. I know that they're out there, in the deep forests of the Pacific Northwest, and probably in wild areas around the world, living their lives in parallel to ours while remaining invisible to our science and our society. They're intelligent, they're peaceful, and they're trying to survive in a world that refuses to acknowledge their existence. They've developed strategies for avoiding human contact that have allowed them to remain hidden for centuries. But climate change, deforestation, and expanding human development are making it increasingly difficult for them to maintain their secrecy. The encounters are becoming more frequent, the evidence more compelling, and the pressure to acknowledge their existence more difficult to resist. Asterisk, I'm telling this story because people deserve to know the truth, not the sanitized version that appears in official reports, but the real truth about what's sharing our world with us. The next time you're hiking in deep forest and you hear something moving in the trees, something that doesn't quite sound like any animal you know, remember this story. Remember that intelligence takes many forms, and that some of our closest relatives may still be out there, watching us from the shadows, hoping that someday we'll be ready to accept them as fellow inhabitants of this planet. Asterisk, because it wasn't a bear. There really is something between the trees, and I know, because I've looked into its eyes and seen the reflection of our own humanity staring back at me. I've witnessed communication between species that suggests possibilities for understanding and coexistence that could change our relationship with the natural world forever. But first, we have to overcome the forces that want to keep these truths hidden, the institutions that profit from maintaining the status quo, and the fear that prevents us from acknowledging that we're not alone on this planet. The truth is out there, in the deep forests and wild places where our ancestors once walked alongside creatures that we've forgotten how to see. They're waiting for us to evolve beyond our need to dominate and control everything we encounter, waiting for us to develop the wisdom and humility necessary to share this world with other forms of intelligence. Until that day comes, they'll remain hidden, protected by their own intelligence and by the willful blindness of a society that isn't ready to accept the implications of their existence. Asterisk, but the evidence continues to accumulate, the witnesses continue to come forward, and the truth continues to persist despite all efforts to suppress it. Someday, when we're ready, when we've learned to approach the unknown with respect rather than exploitation, they might reveal themselves again. And when that day comes, I hope we'll be wise enough to welcome them as the fellow travelers on this planet that they've always been, rather than as curiosities to be studied or resources to be exploited. Asterisk, until then, I'll continue to investigate, to document, and to protect the truth about what I've seen and experienced, because some truths are too important to be buried, and some encounters are too significant to be forgotten. The creatures are real, they're intelligent, and they're trying to coexist with us in a world that's becoming increasingly difficult for all of us to navigate. The least we can do is acknowledge their existence and work to protect the wild spaces they need to survive.